Previously on the Lagosians podcast.
It's like learning another language.
Yeah.
It's something that's brand new. It's not like
Pretty fitting, actually. Yeah. And so it's written kind of like if you're trying to read a translation of some old Greek legends and stuff like that. So it's intentional that it's that way.
His pages are just completely filled with poems and songs, and randomly almost you'll have main characters or primary characters just break out into ballads that they write on the spot. So there was Eru, the one, who in Arda is called Iluvatar. And he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought. And they were with him before aught else was made, and he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music. And they sang before him, and he was glad. But Melkor. So Iluvatar declares the first theme, and everything is going great until the singularity that we talked about earlier kind of rears its head. Melkor, who has spent time alone, not in fellowship with his brothers, decides rather that he is going to put his own spin on things, but not in the free, creative way that was referred to earlier by the other Ainur. He actually tries to make the theme bend to him. He intentionally causes discord. And it says that there are those around him, other Ainur, who feel this and then start actually to bend their song towards him. So essentially out of this one theme, you then will have two combating musics happening. The music that is being presided over by Eru, God, and then the music that starts to build up, led by Melkor, that is trying to disrupt the music of Eru. Then Iluvatar arises, and it says he perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his hand, and a new theme began amidst the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme, and it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it, and again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. So it gets more intense. The Ainur start getting scared, and everything starts getting really weird as Melkor continues to defy the will of Eru. Then, again, Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern. He lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion. And it was unlike the others, for it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched. And it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. And this is in reference, of course, to Eru's theme. Now, the third theme that was just referenced here is actually a symbol of foreshadowing of the coming of the children of Iluvatar, and this is where we actually get the first reference of these people. The children of Iluvatar in these works are the firstborn, which are elves, what we know them as, or the Eldar, and then the followers, which are the Adain, or men. And those are the two main players, as many people know, even from watching the films, two of the main players in the histories of this planet. And so this is really important stuff. So after the theme concludes, basically Eru stands up and just brings it all to utter silence, and everybody's terrified. He then kind of praises Melkor for like being the mightiest of the Ainur, and you have a gift of all your brother, kind of restating the stuff at the beginning, but then also chastises him for essentially for his pride standing up and coming against him. And then there's this isolated quote that this is one of my favorites in the whole book, which is when he basically brings the hammer down on Melkor and establishes some of the stuff that we've already discussed, which he says, "And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me." You see, even the language used here, it's like sounds like something out of the King James Bible. "Nor can any alter the music at my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Again, this is going to be a continuous theme throughout these works, is Eru, and this is where you really, in my opinion, see the direct lineup with the Judeo-Christian God, is this theme of God taking the things that were meant for evil and turning them to the good. And that is really what all of this, like these works, all reflect that in some weird way. Even if you can't see it in the macro level, like you'll see it in other ways. So
Right, it's kind of like a Job sort of moment where he
Yes.
appears out of the thunderstorm and is like, you don't know anything about all this stuff. Like, I was here when all this was made. I know how this theme is going to play out.
yeah,
Except in this case, of course, he's saying it to more of a Luciferian character.
yeah,
Yeah. So question as far as this goes.
Yeah.
If so, my understanding was that Tolkien didn't want it to be I guess, fairly obvious
Allegorical,
of the connection between that and Christianity and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, so why does it seem like this is so obviously in parallel with, Christianity?
It's in the beginning of this book. There is not only a foreword by Christopher Tolkien, but also a letter from J.R.R. Tolkien to a dear friend who was apparently asking him about a lot of these things and asking him to kind of unpack it. And in here, he specifically does point out that he doesn't like allegory, but there are several moments when he begrudges that. Of course, this is the more obvious thing. Like for example, about the final battle, the Dagor-Dagorath, he'll say, well. More than anything, this obviously is a symbol. This reflects Ragnarok. He'll say that. So he doesn't like allegory, but will begrudgingly admit when there are some of those elements. I think that's the case here, because this is clearly, in my opinion, in my reading of this, is clearly the Luciferic story.
All right, so because I understand, so as far as the allegory stuff goes, and especially if these are myth makers, and so if you're writing a story. And really, the stories that are going to capture you are the ones that actually have that truth. There's truth in them, right? And so, of course, the true story within, the true story of humanity, which is Christianity, basically, you're going to have that, and there's a little bit more pull, I think, to that whenever it's actually the true story. But anyway, it just seems to me so that's going to happen. Like whether or not Tolkien wants it to happen or not, right? It's going to have kernels of truth to it if you want it to be the best possible story, right? I would think. And so there's no getting around that. It's just interesting because of that. As far as Tolkien, it always seemed to me that he didn't want that to be kind of fairly obvious when clearly anybody reading this, if they understand the creation account, man, this sounds a lot like Genesis, but in a weird way. But that's what it is.
So it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about this. His intention was to have this be this other creation story, and this is the creation story from the elves' perspective that they're passing down as the way that the Silmarillion is supposed to come to us. And so it's not exactly an allegory. I mean, it's not like a one-for-one allegory anyway.
Yeah, sure.
But it is kind of clear that it's sort of like how the early church fathers would say that there was some sort of truth revealed to the Greeks in some of the philosophy and stuff, that there's this aspect of it that's very similar to the Christian creation account, because this is what was revealed to the elves, and it kind of ties back in with the whole baptizing the imagination sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that, just to be real, this is just one of those things for Tolkien. This is one of those rare spots of Tolkien where I don't necessarily line up with him, where I don't understand the hesitancy with allegory. Because I'm actually like you. I think that there are several elements of his stories that are overtly, from my understanding and my reading, they come across as allegorical, whether they are heavy-handed or not. But ultimately, I think sometimes I wonder if well, I know it's not the case, because he specifically has said in interviews and written in letters that he despises, how does he say it? Allegory in all of its manifestations, or something like that.
Cordially disliked allegory in all of its forms and manifestations.
Yeah. So that I don't quite understand, and I don't guess any of us ever necessarily will, but I agree that I think it's hard not to read through this specifically and not be reading the writings of someone who was obviously of the faith. Because to me there's so many parallels, specifically though with the Luciferic character, because I'm not aware of any other religious worldviews where the where the celestial war, so to speak, is kind of presented somewhat similar to this, even though, as we will see, that's not necessarily what happens. But specifically, Melkor himself just seems very much like the devil, and I think that plays out in the rest of the story too.
Yeah.
But specifically, as we've pointed out, his motivations are almost exactly the motivations that I think a lot of people in Christian tradition associate with Lucifer and his fall.
Yeah, I think, but see, like, so for me, so coming at this, not knowing much about it and everything, if I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, this is just a weird way of talking about the Christian, it's just a retelling of this type of thing. And I know in a sense that it is, but I do, like, it just clicked. I love the idea that it really is the elves' perspective. Like, if the elves wrote down this history of the world, of how the world came to be, like, this is their story. And so then that just makes more sense to me.
And in the case of this, as we'll get to later, a lot of the elves live in Valinor with the Valar. And so this part would be passed down to them from the Valar, I assume. Or that would be the, like, in-universe logic for it.
Actually, I think it's worth, because this has now come up a couple of times, it's actually worth pointing out from the beginning that much of the Silmarillion, the vast majority of it, in fact, is the story of the elves. So much of what we're going to be going through here is from the perspective of them. And even the men in the story that we do cover, most of them are people who were educated and lived among and were connected to, by alliances and friendship, the elves. So this is the Silmarillion is an overview of a period of time, or multiple periods of time, on Arda, on this planet, in which the elves had primacy. It was the age of the elves, you could say. Whereas the things that most people are familiar with, which is the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, those take place in an age where the strength and primacy of the elves has faded, and that the age of men has come. So the things that we're going to be reading over, even though there will be some familiar names, we'll see some familiar places and all these kinds of things, this is actually a very, very different world than what happens in the Lord of the Rings. And that even reflects, like you guys just pointed out, in what we're reading right now, which is this, what was clearly either a oral tradition that was passed down or something that was written down, but specifically by elves. This is essentially the elven take of what happened in the very beginning. After that, after the theme comes to a close and Melkor is essentially shamed, something amazing happens. Eru ends up then showing them a vision. It says, and they saw a new world made visible before them, and it was globed amid the void, and it was sustained therein, but it was not of it. And as they looked and wondered, this world began to unfold its history, and it seemed to them that it lived and grew. What this vision that Eru shows them, is actually showing them that the songs that they just made, all three of the themes, had manifested themselves forward into creation. What they had sung into being was, in fact, a world history, was, in fact, a sequence of events that they had no idea. And apparently, in this vision, they saw sediments and basically they got a vision into, like, space and time, what would be called space and time. Within space and time specifically, there was a world that unfolded that was called Arda. So in the vision of Ea that the Ainur see, they really see two things that really, above everything else, just have them enthralled with the beauty of it, that they just love. Number one was water. And the reason given is apparently within water is most clearly held and sustained the original music of the Ainur of creation. So it hints at the reason why elves are so drawn to the sea, is that it actually echoes of a music it echoes something that they don't know what it is, but they just know that they're drawn to it. So number one is just the substance of water, which of course is where we get the introduction into the second of the Ainur in the story who are mentioned, who's mentioned by name, who is Ulmo, who is an amazing character. But the other thing that they actually see in this vision on Arda is the children of Iluvatar. The ones that we had mentioned earlier. So for the first time, they see the firstborn, well, specifically they see the firstborn, because they actually don't see the rising up of the followers. And that's one of the mysteries that they don't know when they enter, and they don't know when the men are going to rise, but they see elves. But they see them and they love them, and they know that they are the children of Iluvatar's thought that they had not seen before, and they were enamored with this world and thought it was the most beautiful thing, and then suddenly the vision stops, and he even says for the first time they beheld darkness, something that they actually didn't have reference for before, but then now after the vision they had. Well, the Ainur would then, specifically Melkor as the chief among them, their thoughts were just continuously drawn to this vision that they had and the world that unfolded before them in Arda itself and the children of Iluvatar specifically. Actually, it was Iluvatar himself who actually sensed this, and he was the one who actually said, "I know the desire of your minds, and that what ye have seen should verily be, not only in your thought, but even as ye yourselves are, and yet other. Therefore I say, Ea, let these things be." So that's actually what Ea it means. It's essentially let it be or come into being. So the thing that they had envisioned, that their music had foretold, Eru created for them. He gave them access to go into it. The Ainur who chose to go in would become known as the Valar, like what we said earlier. So in the vision that they had seen, Melkor sees in his innermost thoughts and desires, he sees all that manifested into this world. So basically, remember earlier when we talked about how, Melkor raising up a musical theme that contested and tried to disrupt the musical theme of Eru? Well, he actually gets to see what that looks like played out in the world, and that's where he sees discord and destruction and all these things, and that are actually ultimately his doing. He also sees that all of these things end up serving Eru's grand design as, quote, tributaries to its glory, which once again goes back to that other thing that we're talking about is really heavy early on. With God takes the things that are meant for ill and he makes them for the good. But this part I think is really interesting. It says Melkor feigns, even to himself at first, that he desired to go to Arda and order things to the good of Eru's children.
Yeah, it kind of relates to a C.S. Lewis quote where he talks about how the worst person to be in charge is someone that does it with the benefit of their own conscience, because they could torture you to no end with that. So it's this whole this idea that they're seizing power for what they think are good reasons, and that actually can be worse than someone who's just doing it for their own benefit. And so, Melkor, kind of wants it, it sort of says to order things to the good of creation. And there's this theme that runs through Tolkien about, there's Melkor, and then Sauron was a Maiar to Aule, who is the smith of the Valar. So there's this running theme about these craftsmen who become obsessed with creating these perfect works that end up going astray.
Yeah. So it hints, all of this hints that there's this balance, that God actually delights in us being creators, sub-creators.
Right, which he allows the Ainur to do along with the theme when he just raises a hand, propounds them a theme, and then they go at it.
Yeah, and this is all spoken to be to his delight, is specifically how it says. But so the border, there's a line, and I think that this is exemplified in, actually you just mentioned him, but Aule, we'll get to explore a little bit more about him coming up, but there is a line between that a sub-creator should not cross, because what the sin of Melkor is ultimately that the sub-creator desires to step into the position of just the pure creator, the complete agent, to create themes that are not in line of what of what Eru intends. I think an important theme of right here is specifically that he's feigning this sympathy to himself, ultimately saying that it's not true. He is just convincing himself of this to justify it. It goes on not too long after this to expound the deep hidden things in his heart, which is essentially that in his innermost heart he desires people to make subject to himself, to call him Lord, is what it says specifically. So He's leaving some stuff out when he's feigning the stuff to himself. I want to go down there and order things to the benefit of the children of Iluvatar as their lord. And in there is the problem that we run into with Melkor. So a select number of them choose to go in, some of which are accompanied by these lesser angelic beings that we've discussed called Maya. So there's a heavenly host, a portion of the heavenly host that enters into Ea. And oddly enough, when they go in, they're shocked because they get in and they find out that nothing's created. It's blank. It's void, so to speak. And turns out God has, Eru in this story, has sent in the flame imperishable and is allowing them, he's allowed them to see a vision of what will be, what they will create on his behalf. So they show up with a blank slate, having now seen beforehand a vision of what it is supposed to be, and then now begins their labors of bringing to fruition what their vision was. So we see that in the creation of the world, the discord of Melkor manifests itself in all of this stuff happening. And then you see that Melkor tries to lay claim to it, backs off. But then something interesting happens. You actually see when they enter in, not long after they enter in, the Valar will actually take physical form for the first time. Because up until this point, it's not actually said that they have physical form. They're like just these, they're luminous beings, essentially, beings of light. They choose the form of the children of Iluvatar. They model themselves after the vision that they saw, which I think is really a really cool explanation, because that's one thing that I've always wanted to know is like, well, why are if human beings who in reality are the children of God bear God's image, then what image do like Michael and all like a lot of the archangels and stuff we see, like, because you always see them depicted as man, but where does that come from? And I think this is actually a pretty interesting little explanation that like they actually saw foreshadowing of the children to come, and they were just so enamored with that image because it is the image of God that they replicated it.
Yeah, and of course they're going to be amongst the children, so what better form to be in than one that is like representative but more, I guess, glorious than the elves that they're going to be around.
Right.
As opposed to, you know, some of the visions that you have in like Ezekiel and stuff when it describes angelic beings and you don't know what to make of it in those visions where there's like eyes and wheels and all kinds of crazy stuff happening.
Yeah.
Now, all the whatever, they're all slight shapeshifters, aren't they?
So
to an extent?
Yeah, well,
it says that they put on their form like we put on clothes.
yeah, it specifically says.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because, you know, they're not physical beings. They're spirit.
It also hints that they can walk amongst the children of Iluvatar unawares. So like they can definitely change the way that they present themselves. But the form in which they take on and apparently for the majority of the time present themselves is as just like in at least the shape of people, and just with ridiculous in their splendor and their presentation and all that stuff. Gotcha. So yeah, they take on these physical forms. Not long after, well, I say not long, that's not true at all. Like a lot of time passed. Actually, it's inexplicable how much time passes from each one of these eras. But Melkor himself returns, except this time he lives up to his name, which in it would be Sindarin, or no, Quenya here, right? In Quenya means he who arises in might, is actually what his name means. So after a period of time after he withdrew, and a lot more of the world was formed by the likes of Aule and Ulmo and Manwe, and then all the rest of the Ainur, Melkor apparently eventually decides that he's had enough, and he shows up. Apparently on the earth, it says it's crazy. It says as if a mountain that wades through the sea, whose feet are like clad in ice, and whose crown is that of fire. So once again, this idea of extremes, like extreme cold and extreme hot, and apparently they have from that point on, as Aule tries to shape the earth and do all these things with the craftsmen, he would build up mountains. It says Melkor would throw them down. Ulmo his seas would be formed. It says Melkor would spill them. Manwe would construct things of high places, and then so there was just this constant struggle, which is how Tolkien explains the quote unquote like imperfections of the world. that the seeming chaotic nature of nature is actually basically the battlefield of a battle that happened a long time ago. That Melkor and the Valar butted heads, but regardless of Melkor's attempts, the world, the habitation of the children of Iluvatar was finally made. So, for the next episode of the Logosians podcast and the Lion and the Ring series, we're going to be going through Chapter 2 of the Silmarillion, and which is the Valaquenta, right? Correct? Yeah. So we're going into the Valaquenta, and then from there, we're just going to continue to march through. Once again, thanks for joining us, everybody. My name is Joshua, Dylan, Derek, Charlie, and Tim, the Logosian at home. Until next time, we bid you all a very fond farewell, and we'll see you next time.